This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission, as you know, to help patients trust the products they depend on. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you have an interest in an FDA-regulated company or its product, it's the podcast for you. Today's podcast, I love to say that I know what we're going to land up talking about, but I think it's going to be just a really interesting mix of conversations. I already know that I want to talk about audience testing, because I think that'll be really interesting. And we're talking to someone who is in the business of health literacy, and you'll know why in about a few seconds. So if you are in the life sciences, if you're in public health, you should care about the talk today. So if you are in medical affairs, if you are in public health, if you are in government affairs, if you're a CEO, stay tuned. You might find the conversation to be interesting. Our guest today is the president and CEO at Health Literacy Media, therefore the interest in health literacy and the expertise in health literacy. Our guest for today, ladies and gentlemen, Katina O'Leary. Katina, good to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you again.
This is great. You've been on before, so everyone already loves you. We're just going to have you on now and reaffirm their love for you. So Katina, tell me more. What have you been up to nowadays? What's different from the last time we spoke?
Well, the last time we spoke was right about a year ago in the beginning of COVID. Right? It was. So wow. We spoke then and we talked about how health literacy and health information potentially would influence what happened with COVID and how the businesses would change and what we needed to know and what our experiences were. And we didn't know anything at that point except that everyone was struggling with figuring out how to talk about the new risks in COVID and how to function in a new environment. And a year later, I would say that we know a lot more about COVID, certainly, but also how it's affected all of us in our communities and how we need to think differently about how we talk about health information. And so it's been an interesting year, but we've come a long way for certain.
Now you talk about this idea that we know so much more. I want to delve a little bit further into it because I feel, at least from my perspective, as someone who's not an expert on educating in the public domain, do you see more rumors and guesses being thrown at the wall saying this is how you do it? Or is there more of a consensus at this point? So I find that most knowledge sort of starts off with, I have a gem of an idea. There are 1,000 ideas that come out of that. And then over time, we sort of come back to a mean or a decision of how we want to proceed from now on.
Sure. I think COVID has been a great example of public health and health communications and sort of testing the best evidence strategies. And we've all sort of been called to put our best practices into play. And, I think over the year, it's changed a lot. I think earlier this time last year, there was a lot of unknown. There was different use of internet and communications around this. There were lots of politics and lots of fear and uncertainty. And so the way that we talked about the public health implications, risk, what people should do is very different than what we're talking about now. I think it all boils back down to our best evidence strategies. We want to be clear. We want to address misinformation and skepticism directly and head on. We don't want to sort of reinforce incorrect assumptions or beliefs. We also don't want to debate and battle with people in such a way that we turn them off from listening to our messages. I think we've always known that, but we've had to really practice that this year because there are so many opinions and attitudes and so much feeling wrapped around it. So we've had to really think about, key strategies like who is the audience, what do they already know, what do they need to know, what matters most to them, and really sort of understand why those things factor into our health communication messages. And we always need to do that, but it's never been more important than it is right now.
Now that's interesting you say that. It's interesting you say that we need to have a better idea of who the audience is and make sure we don't turn them off. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. At least we saw a lot of that early on in COVID, where people ranged from, I don't believe it exists, to I believe it exists, but it doesn't cause the same amount of harm, to I believe it causes harm, but it's not that bad, to I believe it's pretty bad, but it could be worse, etc. So when you're creating or crafting a public health message, how do you decide which of those audiences you go after? Because do you try to just move the needle one tick to the left, or do you have to, in situations like COVID, aim for the entire gamut and try to move them further along?
And, I think that's a really good question. And I think it depends on who you are and what your function is. So we're seeing folks at highest level of government, for example, CDC, the White House, other people, Dr. Fauci certainly, who are taking sort of the highest level approach, and they're addressing the biggest topic and telling people exactly what they need to do. So the messages like, get vaccinated. When people are asking questions like which vaccination to choose, they're saying get the vaccination that you have access to. The sooner you get it, the more important it is. Get the one that you can get now. All of those things, and those are the big, overarching public health messages that everybody needs to have. But some of the work that we're doing is with smaller groups and populations that have different concerns. And so those big messages aren't necessarily right for them. So I'll give the example of a group that we are supporting somewhat in St. Louis. There's a group called Prepare St. Louis, and they work with the regional response team. They're all focused on COVID, but Prepare St. Louis in particular is focused on helping people of color and professionals of color learn to help their own communities. And what they know is that in some of the communities that are here, there is a different level of vaccine hesitancy. There are people who are still concerned, and there are valid concerns. There are reasons that people are not ready to just immediately get the vaccine. People have questions. So instead of just saying, hey, get the vaccine, we said so, there's a real focus on understanding what people's questions are, what matters to them, what they need to know to make their own informed decision about what they're going to need to do. And that helps not turn off communities so that people can get the best answer and make their own choice. So this aligns with shared decision making and other strategies that are really important. But in communities that have a lot of hesitancy or a lot of concerns, real questions, rather than just say this is what you should do, some of the best people working on this I know are really digging into the conversations and trying to understand what questions are outstanding, what people need to know in order to move forward. Does that make sense?
It does actually make sense, but that raises a whole slew of things that I think we've been battling against, which is this idea of let's tackle the issue. I was trying to keep it to the end because it's so fascinating, but to quote Robert Frost, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubt if I should ever come back. So vaccine hesitancy. That's super hot right now because it's not just the lay audience going, you know what, I don't want to get the vaccine. It's people who are clinicians going, I know what the vaccine is, I know it's important, but I'm not willing to put myself out there to get the vaccine. So how do you educate people who are often very well informed?
Sure.
And is it about education at all?
Well, I think it goes back to those questions and sort of helping people sort of sort through what their concerns are, right? So if your concern is that you have a serious health condition, you have a serious allergic reaction, you're a person who's pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, you have all of these health conditions that are, making you have concerns or different questions. It's not about telling you that those are wrong. It's about helping you think through what's the real question at the core, what's the scientific evidence that you need to know in order to understand the facts around that. And then how do you decide for yourself what's the right thing to do? Or how do you decide for yourself in context of a conversation with your doctor? What do you need to have or know to make the decision that's right for you? So it's less about my opinion. It's less about giving people certain information that is definitive, but it's more sort of working through their questions and helping them pull out for themselves what their fears are, where those fears come from, what's that about? The Prepare St. Louis folks do a great job of talking about this in one way, though, or in lots of ways. But one of the things they talk about is what matters to you, what matters most to you. And so if you start to think about what matters most, and if what matters most is getting back to see your family, being around your older adult, your grandparents who maybe have some other health conditions. If you have people in your family who are not able to get the vaccine, it may be worth it to you to go ahead and consider getting it yourself, even if you feel you have some concern, because doing that can give you permissions, can give you more certainty in these other situations. If you're a healthcare provider and you're in a high-risk situation, I've heard people say, I was kept skeptical for myself, but then I realized, that I'm living with, my, mother who has a health condition and my child who can't get vaccinated. And so it's important for me to do everything I can so that I come home and potentially make them more safe. So thinking about in the context of your own life, what matters most, what do you want to get back to doing, and how does vaccination help or not?
So that's a really interesting discussion, which is you will be able to, for example, what matters most to you. For a lot of people right now, they're getting sort of a little sick of being stuck at home, and there's one of the things is travel if you get the vaccination. Okay. But I've seen on my LinkedIn feed, and I'm thinking of this physician in particular whose position is, aren't you then holding us hostage until we do? And so I guess the question I'm really asking is, he's a physician. He knows what he knows. So it's not a question of, do you know the information? It's a question of, you perceive things a specific way. From your perspective, as you're helping them go through shared decision making, what if their position is, I've heard you, but I still don't want to get the vaccine? Do you then respect that?
Absolutely. So when you say they're holding us hostage, what I hear is that's a political statement, right? So perhaps somebody, if I were to guess about their political affiliation, maybe a person who's libertarian or, has a political affiliation that is much less interested in having government involvement in their own choices. And, I'm probably not going to change their perspective about that. Right. But I can talk about what that means for the other people in their life, what that means for, their ability to do certain things. We're hearing right now that a lot of universities are saying students can't come back on campus if they haven't been vaccinated.
Yeah.
You have to decide what that means to you or not. And if your position is still they're holding us hostage and you've got an issue with that, you may be the one in your community, the 10 in your community, the 100 in your community, depending on where you live. You may be the one that's not doing it. And, it's okay. Everybody doesn't have to be the same. We just need enough of us that are the same that we can sort of knock this out. And, for some people, it's not going to be the right choice. But, we hope that for everybody who can safely do so, that they seriously consider it and they put it in context of what matters most and what makes sense in their life and make the choice from there.
So one of the ways to get there is using audience testing to find out what the audience actually wants to,
right,
is looking for. Could you talk a little bit more about what that is? Because you have a certain expertise and you've been focusing on this area based on our previous conversations.
Sure. So our main work at Health Literacy Media is creating materials for a wide variety of people who have health conditions or need health information. So we create materials in all kinds of formats, and we send that back out to the public. So what we do a lot of plain language clinical trial summaries, for example. So we write based on the scientific documents what we think is understandable to people who've been in the trial or people like them, and we're going to send it out for the public, and it's supposed to be clear to them. Every single time we do one of those, we want to go back and talk to people who have had experience. They've either lived with the condition themselves, or they're a caregiver for the person who lives with the condition, or they're a healthcare provider, or they have some knowledge that can help inform us about whether we got it right or not. So every single time we go back out to the audience and we ask them what they think and what they experience. Over the last, couple of years, we've done, hundreds, if not thousands of these interviews. We typically do them in one-on-one interviews so that we can really dig down with people about their own experiences. And when you think about vaccine hesitancy, this is a great example. It's so personal. The reasons that people feel for or against have to do with things that are very private. So trying to do that in a group is not always workable. So we tend to talk to people one-on-one so we can really talk about the very specific details of their personal experience, what they are wondering about, what they need to know, what they already know, what the questions are, We try to understand sort of from a cultural perspective how certain things sort of hit or miss, and work our way through. And it's fascinating because, again, I have a group of 14 right now. We're really diverse in our educational background, experience, age, race, gender, geography, education, all kinds of perspectives. But we write these a lot, and we get used to sort of communicating in a certain way. And so, every time we go out and talk to the audience, they tell us something that we didn't know. Every time we think we've gotten something so right, somebody will come back and say, oh, no, you don't understand that at all. You said that there was a little pain like a pinprick. This was the most excruciating thing I ever experienced in my whole life. You have to be more clear. You're supposed to be telling the story that's true, not sort of minimizing or overblowing or whatever. But so they really give us that real feedback about what their real concerns are and how they experience what we've written. So we do that with almost everything, and it's really an important part of our work.
So when you talk about audience testing, let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
Let's say we've got a let's pick Alzheimer's for some reason, and let's say that we're going to come up with a new drug. There are new studies being done around Alzheimer's. You're now going to go out. You're going to, as required under EMA Policy 70, you're going to go do a summaries. So that's great. My question for you is, how do you decide who the audience is? Is it patients who have Alzheimer's, in which case that's not particularly useful? Is it caregivers? Is it physicians? How do you start with the audience?
Sure. So every single time we start with that question. So who is this for? And, you think about it as sort of concentric circles. So there's the patient group who's living with the condition. They certainly are the people that we most often hope to talk with. But depending on the burden that it would cause or their ability to do so, we may or may not be able to do that. So if they can't talk to us, we'd go to the next circle, which might be their caregivers, people who live with them, people who have helped them through their condition. We talk to those folks. Then we may take a separate group of folks who are healthcare providers who treat people living with conditions. And we just sort of work our way back from the core audience. We're always trying to keep the people with lived experience in the center, but sometimes it's not reasonable. So Alzheimer's is a good example. Patients who are very, very sick, it may be just an incredible burden on those patients. Patients who are very young, patients who are very old, even if they don't have Alzheimer's, patients or people with intellectual disabilities, we may be asking more than they can give. We just finished testing a plain language summary for kids who have sickle cell disease. And it was really fascinating because, kids with sickle cell disease go to school, they're engaged in life in many ways, they're very busy, they're still kids at the core, but they have this health condition. But when we enrolled them for the trial summary, we really had the experience of just how much energy and effort it took for the kids to participate. So even though we got kids that had the lived experience, we had to think about how much time could we spend, how many questions could we ask, how much could we probe, what could be the expectation for these kids versus kids who didn't have a chronic health condition like that. So we're always considering the core audience and what we can do to make this reasonable, but still get the feedback that's the most direct.
So that's really interesting, right? You picked a really interesting audience there. So let's start with a basic question. You're now doing, as part of audience testing, you're asking questions. Do you see a future, and let's be clear, we're in the very, very early stages of this process and that no one's really sure what the rules are. It's not even globally required yet, which we expect in some sense it probably will be. But in this early stage, do you expect a future where you have some version of an IRB that's saying you can ask these questions, you cannot ask these questions? Or do you see this more in the internet sense where they keep doing A/B user testing and seeing what happens and then adjusting based on what they find?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was on an IRB for about 10 years when I was at Washington University before I came here. We used an IRB for some of our audience testing. For these particular questions where we're testing summaries, we've submitted these a couple times and they've been viewed as exempt because they are basically information to make the forms better We're not publishing the data. There's not funding that's attached to them. The federal government hasn't paid for any part of this. So they don't really qualify under the typical requirements of an IRB. I think it would be interesting to have an umbrella IRB that reviewed the general questions for audience testing reports like this, because I think it makes us all feel safer and better. But to date, that's not really been part of it. I know that I, for one, would be much happier if there was a process for this. But on the other hand, we use a commercial IRB that costs us significant money every single time we do it. And we do a lot of these. And so we would have, constantly many IRBs open to ask the same questions. And it adds a significant cost for not a real direct benefit. So, it feels like the usual processes don't work, and it would be nice to have something that's slightly different for this purpose, but it sure isn't there yet.
Which I agree. Like we said, it's very early in the process, but that's really interesting where you say it would be ideal if in the future these forms get solidified in some way, so that we know that this is the direction we want to take, and having an IRB help with that process could be useful. Now, you talk about kids, and you talk about getting them to sort of opine on this. Do you end up creating different forms? So when you talk about, say, informed consent, you have consents and you have assents. Mm-hmm. And each is for a different audience. One is for the kids, one is for the parents. Using that same analogy, would you see a future in which you have to create, for exactly this type of scenario, a sickle cell lay summary assent, I guess, summary, or and a consent, or do you see that being the same thing?
So for our testing purpose, with kids, what we've been doing is testing kids with the adults, so a pair. So the parent and child, or the caregiver and child, enter the process together. We're doing those online. We give them, even though we don't have IRB oversight for these particular summaries, because it's internal quality data, we do give people information about what would be expected for IRBs and their participation and what it requires, and that they cannot answer questions, and the confidentiality and privacy and all of those things. So we provide all of that information, but we just provide it once for parent and child together. And then in terms of getting into the interview, once we start the interview, we have a separate set of questions that we ask the parents and the child. And at this point, we're looking at two different forms. So we don't think, an 8-year-old can read the same thing as their parent. And we think it's important for kids to have something that they can recognize and see on their own to reflect their participation. So that's really where it shifts for us, is when we get to the actual materials. And we think both has to happen. We absolutely have to report back to the parent the full details, and the kids need to see the version that's age appropriate.
But you're talking about the forms. I guess I'm asking the next question, which is the completed lay summary.
Right, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Oh, okay. So for the completed lay summary, we expect that there'll be a parent version, the adult version that's full and complete and clear, and a companion piece that is age appropriate for kids. And so that's part of what we were testing, is the two different versions to see what kids and parents thought about the different versions.
And what have you found that's anything interesting pop up as you're doing this testing?
Well, lots of things are interesting as we pop up, but the most interesting thing to me is probably, so somebody on one of our teams is going to present this at a talk soon. So one of our sponsors, so I don't want to steal her thunder completely. Sure. But I think it's interesting to know that this is really important information to kids, and it's really important to parents, and families really want to get this data back. Parents, they really want to understand information about their disease or condition. They want to participate. They want to do good. So altruism, it's funny, we talk about people participating in clinical trials for altruistic reasons. And, most of the patient advocates I know say that, we all like feeling good and being altruistic, but most people do it for themselves, hoping that they get a better treatment. But for, the lay summaries and things like this really is people want to participate. They want to give something back. They want to be part of the solution to communicate about their condition. They want to know what happened. This is meaningful and important to them. And that's good. That's interesting. Kids can really stand on their own. They can provide their own information. They have opinions about these things, definitely about their health and what they deserve to know. And yeah, I mean, I think the other interesting thing I would say too is that, and this is no surprise from a health literacy perspective, but adults also like simpler information. So while the parents want all the details, they don't mind looking at it in a way that is much more simplistic and, kid-friendly, young person-friendly. And I think, we've all had that experience of just something being so much easier to read.
It's funny you say that. One of the things I've always found fascinating is, I as a pharmacist, I used to go to these drug dinners, and you'd always see these really complex charts that people are showing on the screen, trying to explain. And it always came back to me as, look, I have a doctorate, I get it. But that's really detailed. You've got like 19 lines on a single PowerPoint slide. And I have no way to parse that. Could you dumb that down to an understandable bite for me that I know what my takeaway is supposed to be? And I'm going, if I need to do this, it's harder when it's a parent, when it's even harder if you're a child. So this, I see a future where explaining something simply is the hardest thing to do. And people start recognizing that. But we can go down that path in the future. There's no reason to go down that individual perspective. But I want to tackle something that I really just want to get into, which is, could you describe the poster right behind you? The one on lack of funds, because I love that one so much.
So what it says is, lack of funds need not discourage from seeking competent medical care. Consult your health bureau. So these are old school health, public health measures or posters that have been put together. But this tells you how long ago people were still talking about universal health care and the idea that healthcare ought to be reasonably priced for everybody. If you could look the rest of the way around, though, I have one that says, I have AIDS, please hug me, I can't make you sick. So taking you back to sort of that period. I don't know if you can see that.
Okay, 80s, yeah.
Yeah, 80s. Immunize and protect your child from World Health Day in 1977. So just this idea that these ideas aren't old or new. We've been talking about this forever. We know what to do and how to do it and how to think about it in many ways, but we still struggle often with the politics, often with understanding the pragmatics. How do we get from where we are to where we need to be? We've been working on it for a long time, right?
Yeah, and the reason I like the lack of funds conversation is because it's very, very appropriate for what's happening today, where between the politics, we're lost on how do we communicate the message of, in the end, all we want is all of us to be better and be healthier, so we can get back to running our regular lives. So have you faced this this issue when you're talking to your clients, and how has that sort of come up?
Well, we hear that all the time. So we hear, we work on health insurance literacy a lot. So people out in the communities everywhere across the country are struggling with, having health insurance or not. Because of the pandemic, many people have lost their jobs. So people who had insurance before don't have it now. Not having health insurance is a problem here in the US, because if you show up and try to get care, obviously you get charges that, you may not be able to cover, particularly if you don't have a job. So we hear this all the time. There aren't a lot of good solutions in communities. We tell people to go to their FQHCs, where hopefully they have all sliding fee scales and people can get in and get visits and all of those things. But, it ought not be a problem, and it is. It's very real.
What is a FQHC, by the way?
The federally qualified health centers. So often these are the community health centers that are, distributed all over the country. But, they're the local health clinics in a lot of communities that treat everybody and everything. And they do a really nice job. And typically people can get in with a sliding fee scale, and it doesn't cost much of anything, if anything, depending on a person's resources. But, it's hard for them to provide the levels of ongoing care that people need, particularly if they have a major diagnosis or something else. And so, we need a more robust solution than the community health centers trying to catch and collect all the issues. I think that's where the expanded Medicaid and other things come into play, Medicare for all at some point.
So it's interesting when you say this, because I'm trying to schedule a podcast with an individual, and shout out to Lydia Green. I don't know if you know her, but she is a pharmacist by profession, or at least by degree. And one of her goals is to have health literacy tools available for everyone. And I just thought the idea of instead of having a drug ad, having a health literacy ad be available for public use was an interesting concept. Have you seen much work done around that, where everyone, instead of talking about the drug, talks about the disease and how everyone can raise awareness through that? Any experience around that?
So we do lots of materials like that. We create lots of materials for diseases, and I think that's really important to have information. I mentioned to you last time we talked, we're doing a lot of work with Longevity Foundation about lung cancer, and a lot of their early work is about prevention and screening, because people really don't know. So much has changed in lung cancer. So it used to be that you had no way of knowing, you would get screened, there were not treatments, and lung cancer was sort of a death sentence. But the therapeutics have really advanced rapidly. And so if you get screened and you find out that you have lung cancer and you find out at the right time, there's a really good chance that everything goes well and your survival is in good shape. And so making sure people know what they need to know to get screened in time is really important. And then that they follow treatment protocols through is really important. And so, we do lots of work like that. But getting back to your pharmacist friend in the ads, the tricky part about this is so much of it is not necessarily that people don't know what they need to know about their own health. It's that even if they do know, they get to systems that don't work for them. So going back to lung cancer screening, there are lots of requirements about who can get screened. And it has to do with like the number of cigarettes that you smoked over a number of years and all of this stuff attached to your age, it's pack years and this and that. So even if you think that you might be at risk, you may not qualify yet because the system doesn't work for you. The same thing with other situations. There are all kinds of places that you just can't do what you want to do for your own health because you can't afford it, you can't get there, you can't access the treatment. So it's not enough that people are informed. It needs to have the whole systems that work around toward health literacy and access for people when they need it.
I find that fascinating. We can obviously keep going down this and have so many more questions to ask, but I'm already past my 30-minute mark, which I usually aim for. You have a question that you'd like the audience to answer for you, based on the conversation we've had. It's the new piece. It wasn't there the last time you came on.
I know. Do I have a question I'd like the audience to ask or answer? Yeah. I think if I were shouting out into the audience that you mentioned when we first started this discussion, they're all sitting in places where they have the ability to influence how health literacy is integrated or not.
Yeah.
So, we have routes into sort of many operations and organizations that are sort of the usual suspects. But all of these other corporations, entities, groups have a need for health literacy too. So they need to educate their workforce. They need to implement health literacy strategies with their own materials and with their processes and plans. So how do we have a conversation together that starts to make meaning and puts this in context beyond sort of the usual suspects? How do we sort of break out of our silo in health literacy and find partners and support them in their work?
What are the usual suspects?
Hospitals, clinics, foundations that are writing materials for health education that, those are the people, pharmaceutical companies. Our biggest partners are pharmaceutical companies who have to write clinical trial summaries and, package inserts and all those things. I mean, they've been sort of mandated by various entities, the FDA and others, that they have to provide information in certain ways. And so those groups are sort of, moving along with health literacy as part of their requirements, and also because they care. But so many other groups don't have mandates. The links haven't been clearly made by the government and other sources. But they do have employee wellness. They have health materials. They have all these needs for health literacy. And and we're not getting there. It's like we just are not speaking the same conversation.
I love that question. Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions. We have a quick fire round. This is new since you last came in as well. They're going to be quick, easy questions. Are you okay to play with them?
Go for it.
When are you most inspired?
When am I most inspired?
Yes.
When or what?
When, what, however you want to answer. What inspires you? Question.
So I really get inspired by things we haven't done before. So when we start to get questions about how do we do this thing that we haven't done, that's when my brain starts ticking of like, how do we answer this question and what do we need to know? I love that. The other piece of it is when we start to talk to people who have a lived experience and they start telling us what we did wrong. That sort of inspires me as well. Like, how do we get this right? How do we do better?
Very cool. How do you define success?
So I'm a mom and I run a company and I'm a social worker. So success for me is this whole team working together, happily functioning well, people who have balance in their work and their life, and us all sort of showing up together every day to do important things.
And what is the best part of your job?
I work with really cool, brilliant people. I love, love, love the people I work with. They're so smart and they're so fun and they're so creative. And I love to come to work. That's been the hardest part of this year, is not being physically present with people that I like so much that should be in my pod. But just as a function of this, we haven't been able to be together like we would all like.
Very, very cool. So just to clarify, I'm going to do a quick summary of our conversation. We spoke about your experience with longevity. We spoke about audience testing. We talked about health literacy in general. We talked about how it sort of comes together with best evidence strategies. We avoided the conversation on politics, but we did discuss its implications. We talked about how to address misinformation and the appropriate battles and debates we need to have to sort of address that. We talked about how do you choose the audience segmentation, if you will, and how you target the proverbial elephant you're going to start biting into. You're going to talk about, we spoke a little bit about shared decision making. We talked about this concept of vaccine passports, if you will, and people will be able to travel and the like. We spoke a little bit about plain language summaries. We spoke about IRBs in the context of audience testing. We spoke about interesting populations like kids with sickle cell and how you see the future sort of developing. And we spoke about FQHC, which was not a conversation I thought we'd go down. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so, but boy, we had a broad, sort of meandering conversation there. It's good stuff.
It was good stuff. Should clarify, nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical advice of any kind. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. For those of you who missed it, where can they find you?
I'm at Health Literacy Media, and you can go to our website.
Very cool. That's healthliteracymedia.com.
Healthliteracy.media. I should get that right.
Healthliteracy.media. There you go. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me at DarshanTalks on Twitter or go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again for being on, Katina.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory Guy, Irregular Podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.